And of course, the Jews pursued the Roman armies who had left. They said, this is the sign of God. The false prophet said, see, we told you that God was going to perform a miracle and that the Romans were going to leave. They pursued them and they killed many of the Romans. Why did the Romans flee? Till this day, it's a mystery, except for the fact that we know that Jesus had said in Matthew that there was going to be a sign. And when his people saw the sign, they should flee from the city. But how could they flee if the Roman armies surrounded the city? The Roman armies had to leave so that God's people could flee. And then, by the way, the Roman armies came back. And they did not retreat again. And everyone who stayed in the city, who did not flee from the city, was destroyed in the city of Jerusalem. In fact, Josephus tells us that approximately 1.1 million Jews were crucified outside the city of Jerusalem. But we're told by the spirit of prophecy that not one Christian perished in the destruction of Jerusalem, because they had seen the eagle and the sun and the worship of the Roman armies. They had seen the abomination. They knew desolation was coming because of that. And therefore, when the Roman armies retreated, they picked up and they left. And therefore, when the Roman armies came back, they were safe and sound. In fact, after this, they actually fled to the mountains. Have you ever studied before that there's going to come a time when in a certain country whose emblem is the eagle, having something to do with the sun, that a decree is going to be given against them and they're going to have to flee to the mountains? Have you ever heard anything like that? Where did Ellen White get such an idea from? Preposterous, right? Not preposterous. It's typology. What happened will happen. And we're going to study this in our next lecture. In fact, notice Matthew 24, verses 16 through 18. Immediately after the abomination of desolation is put up, when the eagle and the sun is worshipped, immediately it says, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let him who is on the housetop not go down to take anything out of his house. And let him who is in the field not go back to get his clothes. In Great Controversy, page 30, we find these words. But God's merciful providence was directing events for the good of his own people. The promised sign had been given to the waiting Christians, and now an opportunity was afforded for all who would to obey the Savior's warning. Let me ask you, is it important to watch the signs? Only those who watch the sign escape from the city. Because some people today say, oh, I'm not interested in what's coming, I'm only interested in who's coming. Well, let me tell you, if you're only interested in who's coming and not what's coming, you're going to accept the wrong who. I can assure you that. Because the signs are necessary so that we will not be deceived. Jesus started this sermon by saying, I give this to you so that you will not be what? So that you will not be deceived. By the way, how many groups in the city of Jerusalem? 2. Was there a separation before the destruction? Yes, there was. Was there a separation before the destruction in the Old Testament story? Was there a sign placed upon God's people? Absolutely. Were they spared when the destruction came? Yes. Also, with this second destruction of Jerusalem, the same happened. Ellen White says in Great Controversy, page 30, not one Christian perished in the destruction of Jerusalem. Isn't that interesting? Not one Christian perished. They were all sealed, marked by God as his people, and they escaped. They came out. And therefore, they were spared. In fact, Josephus, describing the destruction of the city, had this to say, the misfortunes of all men from the beginning of the world, he's almost quoting Jesus, from the beginning of the world, if they be compared to these of the Jews, are not considerable as they were. In other words, this was the worst calamity since the beginning of the world, is what Josephus is saying. Now, I want you to notice one final thing in closing. Do you know that all of those who fled from Jerusalem kept a very special day? You say they did? Was the Sabbath involved in the destruction of Jerusalem in the Old Testament? Those who were spared, were they Sabbath keepers? Was the city destroyed because it did not keep the Sabbath? Yes, you say, oh, but the Jews, they kept the Sabbath. Yeah, they kept a counterfeit Sabbath. They kept their own Sabbath that the Pharisees had created. But it wasn't God's Sabbath. It was a counterfeit Sabbath. But God had a people who kept the true Sabbath of the Bible. In fact, notice Matthew chapter 24 and verse 20. Jesus is speaking about the destruction of the city. And he says to his followers, when they see the sign and they have to flee, he says, and pray that your flight may not be in winter or on the Sabbath. Do you think that might be true in the end time also? Pray that your flight may not be in winter because it will be very cold, or on the Sabbath. Are God's end time people going to be Sabbath keepers? What about all the rest? What was the other sign? An eagle with what? With the sun. And people worshiping the eagle sun god, the abomination that led to desolation. By the way, national apostasy on the part of Israel led to what? To national ruin. In other words, the abomination led to desolation. Is what we've studied clear this evening? Is it vitally important for us to understand history in order to understand what's going to happen in prophecy? Yes, because this prophecy has a twofold fulfillment. Two questions were asked by the disciples. What will be the sign of these things happening, and also the sign of your coming and the end of the world? In our next study, we're going to take a look at the fulfillment of this in the future. The parallel is amazing, and I pray to God that we will all be prepared for what will come.